Today's submitted material is a single, isolated quote by Norman Vaughn. Dream big and dare to fail. Relying on a well-known aphorism without adding unique commentary limits the impact of the core message.
Yeah, it really does. And I mean, that's the primary hurdle we need to just jump right into today. The weakness here is that the text as it's been submitted to us is literally just this highly recognizable quote standing completely on its own.
Right, just floating there.
Exactly. And because it's presented entirely in a vacuum, completely devoid of the author's unique perspective or like their lived experience, it really skirts the very edge of cliché.
Yeah, it definitely risks that.
We are missing the original voice that is absolutely necessary to make the material stand out. I mean, when you just drop a quote like this onto a page by itself, there's no friction for the reader.
What do you mean by friction?
Well, they've seen it on inspirational office posters so many times that their brains don't actually process the meaning anymore. It's just visual background noise, They just read it and move on.
I can definitely see how that happens. But looking at the sheer mechanics of it, I have to play devil's advocate for a second here.
Oh, go for it.
The material is incredibly efficient. I mean, it captures two massive concepts, ambition and risk tolerance, in just 6 words.
True, it is very economical.
Right? So doesn't the extreme brevity of a standalone quote actually make it punchy? Like we usually tell writers to cut the fluff. Isn't this just the ultimate version of that?
I mean, punchy is great for memorization, sure, but it's not always great for comprehension, and I think that's the real limitation of extreme brevity here.
Okay, unpack that a little.
When something is that short and that familiar, we just recognize the shape of the phrase and slide right past it. We don't actually chew on the underlying concepts at all.
Ah, so it's almost too easy to read.
Exactly. When there is no friction on the page, there is no retention in the mind. The reader just nods and forgets it 5 seconds later.
Okay, I like that distinction. Readability versus resonance. So how do we actually fix it? Do I just add a quick sentence before it's saying, like, I've always believed the famous quote, or, as Norman Vaughn wisely said?
You could, but that doesn't actually solve the problem.
It doesn't.
No, because that's just adding padding. It's not adding insight. The suggestion here is to deliberately reframe the presentation of the quote by surrounding it with a counterintuitive observation.
Oh, interesting.
Context that completely challenges its conventional usage. We need to artificially inject that friction so the reader is forced to stop, recalibrate, and actually engage with the words.
Rather than just, nodding along to a platitude.
Exactly. We want to intentionally trip the reader up a little bit.
So like a little intellectual speed bump.
A perfect way to put it, a speed bump.
So what does that speed bump actually look like in practice? Give me a concrete example.
Okay, let's look at one. You could precede the quote with a brief, highly vivid narrative of an unglamorous, deeply frustrating personal failure.
Like a real failure, not a romantic one.
Right. For instance, you could start by describing the highly specific feeling of spending an entire year writing code for a new application, launching it to the public and watching exactly 0 people download it.
Oh man, that is brutal.
You describe the visceral sting of that moment, the embarrassment, the overwhelming desire to just quit entirely.
Yeah, just hearing that scenario makes me wince. That is palpable.
Right? Because it's real. Or, alternatively, you could contrast the quote with a sentence acknowledging the harsh reality that failing actually hurts.
Because people love to talk about failure like it's this noble thing.
Exactly. Instead of treating failure as this romantic ideal that looks great on a poster, you ground it in the painful reality of losing time, losing capital, losing sleep.
So what would the text actually look like?
You could write something like, failure is not a poetic stepping stone. It is an agonizing, expensive loss. But as Norman Vaughn noted, if you want the outcome, you must dream big and dare to fail anyway.
Oh, wow.
By contrasting the romanticized quote with gritty, uncomfortable reality, you give it immense, undeniable weight.
I really, really like that approach. By putting the abstract ideal right next to a painful reality, it stops being a cliche and becomes a hard-won truth. Like it actually earns its keep on the page.
Exactly. It forces the reader to reconcile the two ideas.
But that actually brings up a mechanical problem for me, now that I'm thinking about it.
Oh, what's that?
If we're grounding the quote in all this painful reality, how do we physically connect those two drastically different tones on the page without giving the reader whiplash?
Whiplash is a good word for it.
Yeah, because you're dragging them from the loftiness of a dream straight into the mud of failure. That's a harsh transition.
And that is exactly the next issue we need to tackle. The abrupt presentation of an isolated motivational thought lacks the necessary structural scaffolding to guide a reader through its logical implications.
Scaffolding? Okay, walk me through what's missing there.
Well, think about the cognitive gap between the first half of Vaughn's sentence and the second half.
From dreaming to failing.
Right. The structural weakness in the submission is that there is absolutely no logical buildup and no cooldown. The text demands a massive cognitive leap from the reader.
It just jumps right to the worst-case scenario.
It asks the reader to go straight from the internal, almost ethereal act of dreaming to the harsh, external consequence of failing. It skips over the connective tissue entirely.
The messy middle part.
Exactly. It bypasses the action required, the risk calculated, and the underlying mechanics of why the dream actually requires the failure to materialize in the first place.
It's a huge leap. And just looking at the verbs themselves, there is a stark contrast between dream and dare.
There really is.
Like dream is this passive, safe, internal thing. You can literally do it in your sleep. No one gets hurt when you dream.
Right, it's completely insulated from reality.
But dare is active, it's external. It involves other people and real consequences. They exist in two completely different phases of human behavior.
Exactly. And right now, because the quote just stands alone, those two phases are slammed together in one breath.
It feels very jarring.
The reader is left hanging in midair between the thought and the action.
So how do we fix the formatting? Do we just put a hard paragraph break between the ideas? Like, deliberately format the text to physically separate them, giving the reader a literal pause on the page to process the shift?
No, I don't think that works. A paragraph break just emphasizes the gap. It doesn't actually help the reader cross it.
Okay, fair point.
We don't need a gap, we need a bridge. The suggestion here is to build a logical, multi-part structure around the quote that physically bridges the gap between that internal vision and the external risk.
So we're building a staircase so the reader doesn't have to leap blindly across the chasm from dreaming to failing.
Exactly, a structural staircase.
I love a good structural fix. But if we are building a staircase, what are the steps? I need a concrete example of this so I can visualize it.
Okay, let's use a specific 3-sentence structure to surround the quote.
3 sentences. Got it.
Sentence 1 serves as the anchor. It defines what dreaming big looks like in a very specific, tangible field. Let's use agriculture for this example.
Agriculture, okay? Unexpected, but let's go with it.
You might write, dreaming big in modern agriculture means envisioning a fully sustainable, zero-waste farm that operates entirely off the grid.
Okay, so we have the internal vision. It's ambitious, but it's grounded in a real-world context.
Right. Then, sentence 2 introduces Vaughn's quote as a pivot point. It's the hinge of the entire argument.
How does that sound?
You write, but achieving that radical vision requires the willingness to heed Norman Vaughn's advice. Dream big and dare to fail.
Ah, so the quote acts as the transition from the thought to the action.
Precisely. It turns the corner. And then, sentence 3 provides a synthesis and explains the logical outcome of taking that dare.
Resolving the tension.
You write, that means understanding that a ruined crop, a blown generator, or failed irrigation experiment is simply a required data point, not a permanent endpoint.
Oh, I see. That's very smooth.
This 3-part structure moves the reader safely and logically from the initial vision through the necessary risk to a rational resolution.
That definitely smooths out the transition. It makes the leap feel a lot smaller. But I do have to push back a little here.
Sure.
Does forcing every quote into this rigid 3-sentence template make the writing feel a bit, I don't know, robotic, like a paint-by-numbers essay?
Well, it's a fair concern, but you have to think of the 3-sentence structure as a baseline, not a straitjacket.
A baseline. Okay.
You can vary the sentence lengths, you can expand it into 3 short paragraphs if you want, but the underlying function has to be there.
The anchor, the pivot, and the synthesis.
Right. You must have those three elements. Without that basic structural support, you aren't actually presenting a cohesive argument. You're just dropping a quote and running away.
Contextualizing the abstract. That makes a lot of sense. You're giving the reader some stepping stones so the transition from thought to action feels less intimidating.
Exactly. It's all about managing the reader's experience.
But that actually brings us to a really critical question regarding the audience. Who is actually reading this and trying to cross those stepping stones? Because presenting abstract concepts of massive ambition alongside total failure can be paralyzing rather than engaging for an entry-level audience.
Yes, absolutely. And this is probably the most important lens we can view this submission through today.
The beginner's perspective.
Right. If we look at this from the perspective of a true novice, someone who is literally on day one of their journey, the weakness in the current material is the sheer uncompromising scale of the vocabulary.
It's heavy. The words are heavy.
Extremely heavy. I mean, the words big and fail introduce incredibly high stakes.
But that actually brings us to a really critical question regarding the audience. Who is actually reading this and trying to cross those stepping stones? Because presenting abstract concepts of massive ambition alongside total failure can be paralyzing rather than engaging for an entry-level audience.
Yes, absolutely. And this is probably the most important lens we can view this submission through today.
The beginner's perspective.
Right. If we look at this from the perspective of a true novice, someone who is literally on day one of their journey, the weakness in the current material is the sheer uncompromising scale of the vocabulary.
It's heavy. The words are heavy.
Extremely heavy. I mean, the words big and fail introduce incredibly high stakes.
Right.
For a beginner who is just learning the ropes, being told to embrace daunting, spectacular failure can be deeply alienating. When the human brain perceives stakes that high, it doesn't usually get inspired. It triggers a freeze response.
Which leads to procrastination. Or just, abandoning the project entirely because it feels too overwhelming to even start.
Exactly. A beginner desperately needs psychological safety. They need small, sequential wins to build momentum, not a mandate to risk everything right out of the gate.
It totally makes me think about the process of teaching a kid to ride a bike,
Oh, that's a great analogy.
right? Like, when you take a kid out to the driveway for the very first time and they are terrified of the pedals, you don't look down at them and say, I want you to dream of winning the Tour de France, and I want you to dare to crash into a ditch at 40 miles per hour.
No, you definitely do not. That is a complete recipe for a kid who never ever gets on a bicycle again.
They just run back inside.
It's way too much load for their nervous system to handle.
Right. You tell them to focus on keeping their balance for just 10 feet. You accept and you help them accept that they might scrape a knee.
A scraped knee is perfect.
The scraped knee is the failure, but it's a manageable, low-stakes failure. It's survivable. So looking at the text we have, how can it better embody that scraped knee level of engagement?
Well, we have to adjust the framing.
Do we just change the quote entirely? Something like, dream medium and dare to stumble?
No, I wouldn't mess with Vaughn's original quote. The fundamental truth of it is solid.
Okay, so we keep the quote.
The suggestion here is to deliberately scale down the stakes of the vocabulary in your surrounding text to make those underlying concepts approachable.
So we're kind of translating it.
Exactly. We must translate the extreme poles of Vaughn's quote into beginner-friendly, actionable terminology. We have to explicitly lower the barrier to entry so the reader actually feels equipped to take the dare.
Okay, so we keep the majestic, soaring quote, but we essentially act as an interpreter for the beginner.
That is a perfect way to look at it. You are the interpreter.
Let's give a concrete example of how to execute that translation on the page, because I want to know how we rewrite that surrounding context to lower those stakes, without sounding, patronizing.
Sure. In practice, you would explicitly unpack the quote for novices by defining the terms down to their most manageable size.
Okay.
You would advise the reader to dream one step ahead rather than dreaming big. You tell them that their dream for today isn't to build a billion-dollar company or write a best-selling trilogy.
It's way smaller than that.
Right. It's just to write one decent page of a business plan or one rough scene of a chapter.
You're shrinking the timeline.
Shrinking the timeline, shrinking the scope, and then, crucially, you define daring to fail as simply being perfectly okay with a messy first draft or making small, highly reversible mistakes.
Reversible is a great word there.
You explicitly explain to the reader that failing in this specific context isn't bankruptcy or public humiliation.
Right, it's not the 40-mile-per-hour crash.
Exactly. It's just a typo. It's a bad line of code that you can just highlight and delete tomorrow.
I love that. You're containing the failure. You're explicitly telling them the absolute worst thing that happens today is a typo.
And by doing that, you make the dare something the beginner can actually accept without triggering that paralyzing freeze response we talked about.
You're creating a safe sandbox for the inspiration to actually take root.
Exactly, a sandbox. It's a really brilliant way to ensure the material serves the reader's actual psychological needs, rather than just trying to sound impressive on the surface.
Because we don't just want to be impressive, we want to be useful.
Always. If the reader reads it and does nothing, the writing didn't work. It failed its primary objective.
Wow, we have covered a significant amount of ground today looking at how to take a simple, widely known 6-word phrase and really engineer it into a truly impactful, supportive piece of writing.
It's amazing how much work one quote needs to really land.
It really is. So, to briefly recap our core analysis today. First, the submitted material needs original, unexpected framing to avoid becoming just another cliché that readers gloss over.
Right, adding that friction.
Second, it requires clear structural scaffolding to safely guide the reader across the massive gap between internal dreaming and external daring.
Building the bridge.
And finally, the stakes of the message must be explicitly scaled down so they resonate safely and effectively with a beginner audience.
And to summarize the actionable steps we discussed for the listener to actually implement on the page, first, try adding a personal anecdote of an unglamorous, painful failure right before the quote to provide that necessary friction and originality.
Get muddy.
Exactly. Second, utilize a 3-part anchor, pivot, synthesis structure to physically bridge the cognitive leap from thought to action.
The staircase.
The staircase. And third, explicitly redefine the massive concept of failure in your surrounding text as a series of small, manageable, reversible learning steps.
We warmly invite the listener to apply these structural and tonal expansions to the piece and submit your revised work back into the show for another critique.
Yes, please do. We would love to see how this material evolves once you build that scaffolding around it.
Remember, when you're crafting your message and asking your audience to take a risk, you aren't trying to throw your reader off the bike at 40 miles per hour. You are just trying to help them accept the scraped knee. Thank you for joining us for this critique.